What is the imitation game? No, it's not a reference to the film about the code breakers at Bletchley Park. Although it is, in actual fact, very similar. It's a very similar sort of concept. Imitation game. Imitate to take over a particular organization, an ideology, a train of thought. Why is the centre-right playing the imitation game? And I hasten to add, before we go into the long-form explanation of this, that the centre-right, in actual fact, has adopted the same left-wing lexicon used by far-left groups, in actual fact, and they're riddled with leftist think. Classic examples of it are that notorious centre-right clown, Sargon of Akkad. He calls himself Carl Benjamin to the rest of us. Yes, absolutely. So Carl and his Lotus Eaters crew will sit there on their little podcast on YouTube, and they'll imitate probably 85% of what nationalists propose and what we believe in, and then they'll put the the cream on the top of the cake by saying, "Oh yes, but these people are notorious online racists. They are the real far right. They're extremists." You know, the thing is, the regime regards Benjamin and the Lotus Eaters and everyone in the centre right as far right. No, not the real far right. Far right. We're all far right now, according to the Starmer regime, if we don't swallow his neo-Trotskyist agenda. I don't swallow it. I reject it completely. But, you know, is that really the case with the centre-right? Well, Farage, of course, you know, is so close to the centre-left, it's almost impossible to differentiate Farage from the centre-right and the centre-left. Where is he? He's a centrist. And a centrist, quite frankly, which is the direction in which he's chartered deepfake reform, a centrist is neither. It overlaps into the centre-left and the centre-right when it suits them, quite frankly. And so the whole purpose of the imitation game, I guess, was best demonstrated recently, in actual fact, when Paul Golding, that con man, grifting con man, and I hasten to add that I don't believe Paul Golding was ever a sincere member of the British National Party. I don't believe he's ever been a genuine nationalist as well, in actual fact. And as for Britain First being nationalist, well, get a grip on reality, please. It's nothing of the sort. It's centre-right. In fact, the demo they did at the weekend in Birmingham, we had his clown saying, well, just look at all the diversity marching behind us in our ranks. You know, sounds like the pipe grease boy, Paul Thorpe, who decided that he was pipe grease and not a man recently and ran away to Spain because he just couldn't hack it on the front line, basically. And, you know, Paul used to say, we've got more diversity here than the left. Why is that? Because they are more left than the left? Is there a difference between the centre-right and the left? Isn't it really the case that the centre-right is the centre-left, aping far-left ideology where it comes to nationalists, obviously? You know, that's another aspect of the imitation game. They also imitate the left when it suits them, but primarily they imitate the nationalist right when it suits them, purely to siphon off support into a blind alley where it will achieve absolutely nothing. What they achieve from it, of course, is an enormous amount of ego aggrandizement and self-enrichment through grifting. That's well documented. We know all about the grifting scam. Is there a need to cover that again? Well, we'll do that later in another programme, in actual fact. I've got one scheduled for later this week. However, back to Britain First. So, you know, Golding and Robinson were effectively instructed. In the same way, they didn't come up with a bright idea, you know. They came up with the same idea, as it were, in the same week to imitate the remigration policy of the Homeland Party. And the reason why is because Kenny Smith and the Homelanders were making great strides forward with the remigration policy, and it was starting to rattle people, i.e. the powers that be, the status quo, the deep state, the secret state, shadow government, call it whatever you will. Yeah? There is nothing genuine about the centre-right, other than the fact its genuineness is the imitation game. And so why have they adopted the remigration? Well, they don't believe in remigration at all, in actual fact, because whenever they're put on the spot, they can't define specifically what remigration means to them. They cannot even define the ethnic English, Irish, Scottish and Welsh. According to them, an Amazonian Indian could come here, quite frankly, learn how to speak English, adopt some of the customs, and dress like the English, and they're English. Absolutely. I wonder what the Angles, Saxons and Utes would have to say about that. Yeah, probably not an awful lot in the way of being impressed. But of course, the language was very different than modern English, wasn't it? You know, they were far more direct and guttural, honest, in actual fact. The Germanic language of the Angles and Saxons was an honest language, not this dishonest diatribe that we have today by influence, you know, with Latinate languages, particularly through the Normans, in actual fact. And that's another thing you'll find with all of these centre-right groups, is they all dole out word soup. Because in that way, they think that they're being really clever, and that people will sit back and think, gosh, you know, these people, they're really clever. Just look at all these big words that they're using, you know, and these ideas that they've, you know, adopted at university from the commie database in all of those universities, as it were, and manipulated and modified them to suit the so-called centre-right. That must mean they're really intelligent. Okay, fair enough. If that's what some people believe, that's entirely up to them. I don't believe a word of it, in actual fact. Put them on the spot with original thinking, and nearly all of them will simply fall apart, just crumble like a bag of flour, in actual fact. And if you tackle them on the imitation game, which is the best way to deal with them, in actual fact, so when they're talking about remigration, ask them where the idea came from in the first place, where it originated from, and why they're aping that idea. And they'll say, oh, well, you know, it's nothing to do with the British National Party or the Homeland Party, etc. We came up with the idea. Well, when were your organisations formed? They were formed long after the National Front, the British National Party, the Homeland Party, et al. Do you understand the point I'm making? And so with Golding, Britain First, which was in actual fact the mantra of the British National Party, it used to be plastered all over their banners, their campaign banners, you know, Britain First. Jim Dowson, who went on his merry way, having created that safety valve operation, and left in the capable lands of one Paul Golding, the man who seems to think he's some sort of superhero. I'll tell you how strong a character Golding is. I asked him a question once on YouTube, on Facebook Messenger. It was a very genuine question as well, in actual fact. I simply said to him, why did you not appeal conviction in the harassment cases, Paul? Blocked me immediately, within seconds. Now, you would have thought there was, you know, a man of his so-called strength of character, self-proclaimed strength of character, that is, would have no problem with a question of that nature. But his response to it was to reach for the block button. You're not dealing with somebody who has a particularly strong character, are you really? When they can't even answer a question like that. Because the question obviously scared him for some reason. So I'll say it in public. Why didn't he appeal his conviction for harassment? Well, that's only something Golding can answer, isn't it? Or maybe someone else can answer it, involved in the case. So anyway, let's go back to the crass fake remigration campaign that Golding is running. So what's his policy on remigration? Oh, we just need to remigrate lots of people. Who are these people? Define them. They can't do it. And another class example is in the same week we saw Nick Tenconi, you know, a man who is not of British origin as well, I might add, in actual fact. You know, with his Irish grifter, Ricky Doolan, you know, the gold smuggler, married to a Zimbabwean woman. These are the people who are telling us what Britishness means, you know. There's barely a molecule of British DNA between them, in actual fact. And these people are supposed to tell us what Britishness means, and that if we don't swallow their centre-right garbage, because that's all it is, quite frankly, imitation game rubbish, yeah, then we are notorious online racists. We are racists or wacists. basically. We're the real far right. We're the complete opposite of the centre right, aren't we? And the reason why? Because we are, in actual fact, polar opposites. We have nothing in common with the centre right, and they have nothing in common with us other than this utterly transparent imitation game that they're playing. And I've explained why they're doing it. So Tenconi, he's been quite notorious about it, in actual fact. Attracted a lot of attention, although no real public sport worth talking about. We need to deport millions of them, he said. Millions of them. Millions of whom? Yeah, who are these millions? So the classic example was when he went before Liam Tufts on the dozen. And Liam said to him, you know, are my non-white friends safe under UKIP? And he said, are your non-white friends criminals? No, sir, none of them are criminals. Honestly, I promise, you know, as though Tommy Robinson is not surrounded by criminality. And he said, well, then they have nothing to fear from UKIP. And he's been asked the question in several other places, and it's the same response every time. So Nick Tenconi, quite frankly, doesn't really intend to deport anyone, does he? Maybe remigration should apply to Nick Tenconi and Ricky Doolan and Tommy Robinson, in actual fact. I mean, Tommy Robinson has an Irish passport, openly boasts about his family's involvement in the IRA, and in essence, really, that he's a feeding, because we all know that Tom is a centre-left grifter, a flag-waving centre-left grifter, in love with Israel and Zionism. And that's another point. All of these centre-right groups have one major thing in common, yeah? Zionism, affiliation to Israel, yeah? Speaking in defense of the Israelis, no matter what atrocity, what genocide they've carried out, you know, in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. Why are they so obsessed with Israelis, with Jews in general, in actual fact, you know? And this is another issue that you will always encounter when you're dealing with the centre-right, if you're a nationalist. They will make ridiculous remarks about the Holocaust, the Second World War, and of course Israel and the Jews, because the simple truth is they cannot hold an argument. So they have to pull these infantile left-wing antics, which they've borrowed from the left, which they've aped from the left. And this is the point that I'm making. The entire centre-right is an imitation game. Largely, they're imitating nationalist policy to ensure nationalists don't actually get anywhere. And when it suits them, they're borrowing the left-wing lexicon and also left-wing antics of the nature I've described, when it suits them, to use as a weapon of dissuasion to stop people from hooking up with nationalists, in actual fact, and taking them seriously and voting for them. You see, when the British National Party in the early 1990s was around and rising to prominence, there was no imitation game of any description other than from the Tory party. And there's another notable point, in fact, because all of these groups are originally descended from the Tory party, with the exception of Britain First. UKIP was a Tory faction. Reform UK is a Tory faction. The fake Brexit party, which was UKIP recycled and is now recycled into Reform, also Tories 2.0. And they played the imitation game. Look at Margaret Thatcher. Her imitation game in 1979 to halt the rise of the National Front at the ballot box was to talk tough on immigration. This is the same Tories who'd flooded the country with immigration, in actual fact. And specifically, she said, you know, we're going to stop these Vietnamese boat people from coming here. 3 months after they won the election, the country was being flooded with these Vietnamese boat people and immigrants from all over Africa as well, and also the Indian subcontinent. That is the whole purpose of the imitation game. It's exactly the same thing now with Reform UK. They've also got a little backup operation called UKIP, which is about on the fringes as you can get, in actual fact, but it's trying not to be on the fringes. It's trying to be significant. But if that fails, they've got this UKIP backup safety valve operation. And then, of course, they've also got Britain First. What all of these groups do, and probably the Heritage Party as well, which is minuscule, but what all of these centre-right groups do, yeah, is keep the right, the collective right, divided. That's another one of their objectives, in actual fact. Keep the centre-right divided, whilst at the same time saying, why is it that, you know, we can't be united? Why can't we unify with one another? Well, it's perfectly obvious, isn't it? We can't unify with the centre-right Because they're all fake. They're all con artists, quite frankly, and grifters. And of course, around Tommy Robinson, and even in UKIP, it's just organised crime, you know, on an epic scale, quite frankly. You know, nationalists do not want to be involved with organised crime, particularly Tommy Robinson and his grifting gang, quite frankly. And going back to the Lotus Eaters, I mean, you'll actually see them at times when they're ranting about nationalists. In fact, they rant about nationalists with such venom, you know, you'd think you were actually dealing with the centre-left. It certainly reminds me of the centre-left, in actual fact. You know, I've seen Carl Benjamin and Bo Dade, who is an absolutely appalling creep, pathetic excuse of a man, a lesser man, just like Carl Benjamin in actual fact, sit there sniggering like silly little boys, you know, in the playground. Oh yes, absolutely. You know, these people really are, you know, they're the real far right, you know, they're racists, you know, and yet they're accused of exactly the same thing by the centre left and the far left. Do you understand the point that I'm making? You know, and they deflect it and defend it by saying, well, no, because they're the real far right. It's not us, sir. It's them, sir. They're the ones that you need to look at, because you're only dealing with children, quite frankly. But they're actually quite cunning, conniving children, when you're dealing with people who are not particularly bright, which is what the vast majority of centre-right supporters are. They're not very bright. And this is another thing that I want to say to nationalists, particularly Kenny Smith and the Homeland Party. You know, the centre-right, forget them in terms of trying to recruit any of their activists. They're all compromised. Every single one of them, they are toxic. Totally and utterly poisonous. They will do nothing other than cause disruptive action by design within the ranks. All you need to do is take away their voters, which is a different matter entirely. As for their activists and their members, forget them. They're flotsam, they're dross. There's nothing that you can do with these people. I know for a fact, because when I was the leader of Stronger Out, I actually allowed, you know, 2,000 or 3,000 of them to join Stronger Out, simply for a joint effort to achieve complete Brexit, and had nothing but problems with them. Nothing but problems with them the whole time, in actual fact. Dealing with the Remainers was child's play, quite frankly, compared to the centre-right, because they, in actual fact, were completely toxic, divisive, hooked on disruptive action of every description, one plot after the other to try and replace the leader, in other words, me, because I used to be in the British National Party and you can't cooperate with him because he used to be in the BNP, remember? In other words, he was a genuine nationalist and you can't work with him because the centre-right are all fakes. And that's the truth, isn't it? They're all Tories, quite frankly, to be honest with you. And so this is the point that I'm making. And I have to emphasise it again and again, because it really does need to sink in nationalist circles. Don't waste your time trying to recruit anyone from the centre-right. In terms of the ballot box and the type of voters you need to aim for, in my opinion, is reach out for the 17.4 million, you know, who came out at the EU ref, the vast majority who've not been out since, quite frankly. And they're the people that you need to unite. Because, in truth, 2/3 of Leave voters have never backed Nigel Farage. They're not going to vote for Reform UK at the next general election. Those 2/3 are largely inactive and redundant. But if you can reach out to them and touch that essential raw nerve that brought them out at the EU ref to vote Leave, then obviously nationalism doesn't need to wait for the bubble to burst with Reform UK. But it will burst. But even when it bursts, you know, what you'll have there is a recycling of the centre-right. In what way is this any good to British nationalism? You know, these people are toxic. They've been brainwashed. I mean, I've got some friends, in actual fact, who started off their lives on the right, shall we say, with Tommy Robinson, you know? And occasionally they have relapses. It's like a heroin addict, basically. They go along being clean for so long, and then one day they decide they just don't have the strength to do it anymore, and they have to go and get a fix. So they relapse back into the Robinson crowd, and they spend some time there, and then they fritter away from it again, basically, and come back to nationalism. And these people, quite frankly, are no good either. You know, I mean, if you look at Steve Laws, he's a classic example. So he calls himself a nationalist, but he's actually rotated through several centre-right groups. He's only spent a few months in all of them. He spent a few months in the Homeland Party until he decided he wanted to be even more hardline, in actual fact. And but the ultimate point is, you know, people who don't stick around are no good. And Steve Laws just doesn't stick around in any organisation. And there's actually lots of people just like Steve Laws, in actual fact. Irrespective of the great work that he did in the English Channel, highlighting the boat invasion, you know, Steve does not stick around. And there's lots of people like him. And recruiting these people is also a big mistake as well. You know, because ultimately, in the centre right, there is nothing but prostitution, political prostitution. You know, they switch from one group to the next, like changing partners, you know, a sex swap party, quite frankly. They're political swingers. You can't rely on any of them. But what you can always rely on from the centre right, and this is their only purpose in actual fact, is that they will continue to play the imitation game. And the only way to defeat the imitation game is to be consistent. Don't go even further to the right, which is where they want to push nationalists, so that they become so unpalatable, you know, no one will touch them. That is a huge mistake. That's one of the objectives of their imitation game, is to push nationalists even further to the right in order to differentiate themselves from the centre right. We're completely different anyway, you know. We just have to be very honest and specific about our policies, particularly on remigration, and in that way we can counter the imitation game. And when it comes to the crunch and these people say, oh, well, but there's that organisation and that organisation, well, they're just playing the game, quite frankly. Look at what remigration really is. In essence, it's the repatriation policy of the British National Authority from 1982, and prior to that, it was the repatriation policy of the National Front. So remigration, as it's called today, which is synonymous with repatriation, is just a variation on the theme. None of these centre-right groups existed in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s until, of course, the Tories hatched UKIP, you know? And, of course, that's when their own centre-right safety valve operation began, and it was pumped and promoted relentlessly across the mainstream media until eventually it overtook the BNP, and at the same time Griffin threw the towel in and just handed victory to them on a plate. And of course that's not something that can ever happen again. We're not going to allow that to happen again. But what I will say is this, in closing: when the reform bubble bursts, there will be a great temptation amongst nationalists to go in there and hoover up all of that, how could I put it, you know, that support that's in an organisation in tatters, quite frankly, and it will be. And even if reform forms a government, it will be a huge disappointment. In fact, Professor Betts told me last week that he believes Farage will be a greater disaster than Keir Starmer, and I actually share that opinion, 100% in actual fact. You know, all these people who've been sucked up into the deep fake reform bubble are going to be extremely unhappy and upset when that bubble bursts. The essence is, how big will the explosion be, and in what direction will all the pieces scatter? And that's where nationalists have to be very careful, because that's when nationalism will start to take off again. I'm sorry to say, but this is the biggest battle that nationalists are fighting. It's not the centre left, it's not the far left, it is the fake centre right, imitating nationalism to ensure nationalism cannot succeed. But what the centre right always does, because all of its organisations essentially are safety valve operations, they always get flat packed by design, because they're not designed, they're not crafted to achieve regime change. They don't want to replace the status quo. They're only here to protect the status quo. So my warning is this: no matter what idea you come up with as a nationalist, the Brexit Party, classic example, which I crafted in November 2016, subsequently imitated, robbed, in other words, copyright infringed by fake Farage and Catherine Blakelock and their grubby little lawyer Andrew Reid, an incurable fantasist and liar. There's a classic example of the imitation game. The reason why they did that was to ensure nationalists did not have control of the Brexit Party and all the enormous potential at the ballot box that the Brexit Party had, because Brexit was not being delivered, it was being spiked. And it's being spiked again right now, in actual fact, isn't it? Because Starmer's just done a spiking operation. And where was little Nigel during the spiking operation? Oh, he went off on a holiday because, you know, at the end of the day, the imitation game is safe in the hands of other fakes and con artists in Reform UK. So the battle is, get them in a studio, quite frankly. This is the way to deal with the centre right. Get them into a studio. If you have an opportunity as a nationalist to take on the centre right in a studio debate, get in there, get stuck in, you know, and lay it on the line basically as to who created the remigration policy, where it comes from, repatriation, who's responsible for it, and that these people are just fakes and imitators. You've got to pin them down, and you've got to keep pinning them down. And that's the only way you're going to pinprick that bubble until it bursts. And when it bursts, don't expect to rip all their support. Not on the contrary. Because as I said, most of their activists are just jetsam and flotsam. They're dross. They're worthless, in actual fact. Tommy Robinson's, most of his inner circle are all sniffheads. Junkies, quite frankly. Obsessed with grifting. They're of no use to anyone in nationalism. We don't want these people. We don't need them. They're just criminal trash, quite frankly. Stay away from them. So the imitation game, the way you deal with it is put them on the spot. Put them on the spot on social media. Get them into a studio. Be relentless. Never, ever take the heat off them. Put them under total pressure the whole time. Get them to explain why they've adopted this policy. What's the purpose of it? Specifically, what do they mean by remigration? And obviously, when you're doing this is going to cause them a great deal of consternation in actual fact, because they know they're only faking it, quite frankly. They know they're only faking it. And so if the Open Line Party said, okay, well, we're going to remigrate these type of people, and these type of people, and these type of people, you know, and the centre-right say, well, we're only going to remigrate one of those factions, then you know basically you're dealing with not a halfway house, but something that can only go a third of the way down the road and achieve absolutely nothing, all by design. And this is the whole point with deepfake reform. Okay, people keep saying, well, it's better than what we've got, it's better than nothing. Well, is it? I'd rather have nothing. I'd rather have nothing of any description. I'd rather have, quite frankly, another disastrous 5 years of Labour, which would then absolutely guarantee an explosion towards nationalism, even before that 5-year period came to an end. But yes, absolutely, be always mindful of the fact, the imitation game. As a nationalist, the imitation game is your greatest enemy today. It's not far left direct action units. It's not Jerry Gable. It's not even Nick Lowles and Hope Not Hate and his fairy tale machine. The great threat today to nationalism is the imitation game and the centre right, because the centre right is really the centre left. Put them on the spot. Challenge them about that. That's one thing they really hate. They hate being called the centre left. But just remind them of the fact that they ape the left's lexicon and also their antics. So when you put them on the spot with it, see how they react. You know, their infantile meltdown should be very amusing, but it's ultimately very important to ensure they do have that meltdown in the public domain so everyone can see it. And that's how nationalists can and will win.